unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably been hearing and seeing about how manga is being American comics' butt. And of course, that's for a variety of reasons, but there are many reasons that you do not know about. In this video, we'll be going over them, but to answer that question, we will have to go back in time. Long ago, during the golden age of comic books, all the genres lived in harmony. Well, a lot of genres, not all of them. You had horror, science fiction, action, adventure, war, horror, crime, drama, hardcore romance, and of course superheroes, all on the shelves. But then one day, a psychologist named Frederick Wertham blamed juvenile delinquency on comic books with his book Seduction of the Innocent. Parents and city councils followed suit. There were public comic burnings, and even some city councils started banning certain titles. Eventually, there was even possible government intervention, or at least the fear of it. So that's why companies created the Comics Code Authority, which, contrary to popular belief, was not 100% voluntary. It was an ultimatum. If the companies did not censor themselves, it was just a matter of time before the government came and censored them. Evidence of this would go to the court case against the 1973 about the Zap Comics number 4, which is pretty obscene, but only like 25% more obscene than something like Devilman. And because of that, this led to, I believe, state governments being given the right to like have discretion over what crosses into obscenity. Because of the censorship and stigma, it led to a superhero monopoly, because a lot of the adult-oriented companies were wiped out. And because of the superhero monopoly, many of the problems we know today, such as crisis crossovers every single week, and also how hard it is to start them, and also like all the writers and stuff like that, started forming because there was no competition. Like Marvel and DC had a majority of the market share in the 80s. Marvel having up to 70% of the market share, and with DC having second place. You might be saying that manga had to deal with censorship too, but the censorship they had to deal with was far less extreme than American comic books, because that wasn't until like 1995 when they started to hammer it down on the censorship, at least judging from like court cases and stuff like that. But until then, it was like the Wild West. You had stuff like Devilman in 1972, which in the early 1970s, which had like nudity, gore, and even blasphemy against the Abrahamic religion. You also had stuff like Fist of the North Star, which had gore and even uncensored nipples at one point. You had Dragon Ball, which had plenty of nudity and stuff. Now, then you also had Jungle King Tarchan, which was pretty obscene, like having him open up his urethra like it's a freaking plastic bag. And last but not least, you had Apocalypse Zero, which is probably the last like manga series I could think of, the really obscene manga series I could think of before the whole cracking down on the freedom of it, which even featured at one point a practically almost entirely nude woman with one of her nipples exposed and her other nipple being covered by the stitched on face of a person that was just ripped off. You could not see that kind of freedom in the American comic industry until like the late 80s. Even then, I mean, it wasn't as obscene as some of the shonen stuff there. And again, shonen is for 12-year-olds and up. And because of the superhero monopoly, this would eventually kind of lead to the crash, since you only had a small handful of companies that pretty much controlled everything. Had more companies stayed open, the crash could have been avoided. Because of the crash, two-thirds of comic shops were wiped out. And that was pretty much the only way you can read the books, because of the whole shift towards the direct market, since they realized they can make more money that way. And contrary to popular belief, the main cause of the crash was not Rob Liefeld or the Clone Saga. The main cause of the crash was overprinting, limiting distribution, raising prices, and of course late books. And because of the crash, the companies began to scramble and did a lot of desperate things to kind of get themselves back together. And they started caring less and less about their books and just more about staying afloat. This led to Marvel selling film rights and, of course, more and more shows for all the comic companies, and selling television and film rights left and right, except for DC, that was already owned by Warner Brothers. But then, of course, this leads to another thing we need to talk about manga's success. Manga has anime. Anime and manga have a perfect symbiotic relationship. Because anime follows the manga very closely, most of the time, people will end up reading the manga so they can catch up on next season because it could be a year or two before it premieres. You can't say the same thing about most adaptations here. Even the most accurate adaptations I can think of, like the Fantastic Four cartoon in the '90s, still changes a lot of things. Like they do like the Fantastic Four issue 235 where they fight Ego, but then at the same time, Franklin Richards is not born yet. That's a very big thing. They were like doing the Frieza saga and Dragon Ball and having the future Trunks there. Of course, there's other things too, like Japan's acceptance of the medium and how America acceptance is low. There's even rumors that in Japan, a Japanese businessman reading in the subway in the '80s. '80s, if you read a comic book in high school, you got shoved into a toilet. And of course, this also needs to talk about other things. That lack of genre variety, yes, that is a big reason why we're not doing well. But at the same time, their genre variety is there. You just need to know where to look. Image, Dark Horse, and Vertigo offer plenty of non-superhero alternatives, or even superheroes other superheroes that are easier to start, but they don't really sell that well. Invincible, Hellboy are perfect examples. They haven't really sold that well, despite having great adaptations and being generally good series. Showing that also marketing has to do with it. That leads back into manga. Manga has great is great marketing for the anime is great marketing for the manga. There we are. I mean, if you agree with me, cool. If you don't agree with me, I'm sorry if I couldn't convince you, but you are entitled to your opinions and beliefs. And if you have any comments, please write them down, and I will respond to them. Thank you.